Dear participants, please take your seats. The panel discussion is going to start shortly.
Yeah. Okay, I would like to ask that the panelists please come to the stage. And if everyone could sit down so we could get started. Katya, you can come to the stage, yeah. Ah, very good, you got the memo. Hi, very good to see you. Yeah. So, Kolinda, you can also come to the stage. Everyone can come to the stage.
Phil Jackson, the most successful coach in the history of the U.S. National Basketball Association, once said, "Wisdom always surpasses strength." The Global Baku Forum remains a key platform for discussing transatlantic relations, geopolitical conflicts, and emerging security threats. This year's conference takes place amid heightened tensions in multiple regions. Key discussions will revolve around strategic security realignments, humanitarian aid coordination, and the role of multilateral organizations in conflict resolution. Welcome to the panel, Path to Peace.
Who are we missing? And will all the panelists can come to the stage so we can get started? I think Prime Minister Olmert, is he here? Okay, well, we'll get started. I'm going to stand up first to talk to you, and then my name's Susan Elliott. I'm going to be the moderator of this session, Path to Peace. I think this is an extremely important session, and one of the reasons that we're all here for the Baku Forum, because we're looking for ways that we can make suggestions and constructively look for solutions to find peace, not only in the region, but around the world. I will say that we're going to start immediately with a panel discussion. We're not going to have a one-on-one, so that will allow us to have more time for questions and answers as we move forward. So I'm going to sit down and then we'll get started with the panel. And maybe if everyone could stop talking and start listening, that would be helpful so that everyone who wants to listen can hear what we're going to say. So I'm very pleased to be here today for this panel, which is looking for ways that we can achieve sustainable peace in the conflict around the world. We have a fragmented global landscape, and it's very difficult. It has been difficult to have state-led negotiations and international organizations come to agreements on how to resolve wars and conflicts around the globe. You know, historical successes have been because there's political will of the people involved. For many of you who don't know, I served as U.S. Consul General in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and the people there were decided that it was time to make a decision to find peace, and they were able to do it. No one else can do it but the people involved in the conflict. But how can we, as observers and people from the region and other countries, help those in conflict or involved in war to look for peaceful resolutions to their problems? You know, today we're going to focus on two of the main conflicts that we're seeing now, the war in Ukraine and the crisis in the Middle East in Israel. And what we have found is that, you know, the ongoing war in Ukraine, fragile ceasefire in the Middle East. President Trump has proposed a ceasefire for Ukraine. We want to talk about that. How can that work? How can others be involved in, you know, making solutions to conflict resolution? In the Middle East, the war in Gaza and the pressures on the Palestinians in the West Bank, as well as efforts to mediate conflicts elsewhere, especially in international organizations, haven't been successful. So what we would like to do today, again, is focus on those conflicts and look for ways that we can suggest that, that can be made to reduce the conflict. So what I'm going to do, I've changed the order of speaking a little bit because I want to start out with someone who is involved in conflict, a Ukrainian, Kateryna Yushchenko, who is the former First Lady of Ukraine. We'll start out with her. We'll also talk to some of our other panelists, represent NATO countries, and we will talk about European security. Then we will also speak with our Arab and Israeli colleagues who will talk about the status of the ceasefire in Gaza and in Israel, and get some information about how international organizations can also play a role. So I want to start with you, Katya, if you don't mind if I call you Katya. You know, you're involved in and living in a war zone. And as an American, I'm not always pleased with some of the things I've seen happen in my country. But what we'd like to know from you, I see this morning that President Putin is considering the proposals that have been made. But what is your take on what's happening, and what do you think needs to be done to resolve the war, to end the war? You need to turn on your mic, I think. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank the NGIC for allowing me this opportunity to talk about what is happening in my country, and in general, all our NGIC friends, our family here who has been so supportive of us during this war, giving us a great deal of support and advice, and we're truly grateful. And we want to thank you for being on the side of justice and international law. I would like you to imagine that you have been rebuilding your family home for 30 years. It's not a perfect home, but you love your home. Your neighbors are supportive, you're good friends with most of your neighbors, but you have one that's a little bit, has been difficult through the centuries. And then you find out one day that it's a serial killer, and it comes to your home, it kills your mother, it rapes your wife, it steals your child, it burns down your garage, and then it takes 2 rooms in your house, and it demands more. And you fight to protect. Some of your neighbors support you, and then one of your neighbors said, no, it's your fault that you were attacked. And you are the one that must stop fighting. You know, this seems a little bit extreme, but frankly, that is how every single Ukrainian feels. We feel as if our home was invaded. We feel that it's a very, very clear issue of who is the victim and who is the aggressor. And yet we are often told by some members of the global community that it is our fault. Yesterday, President Vike Freiberg talked about the fact that we are in a post-truth world. And so I'd like to address some of the untruths. In fact, 4 untruths that have been said about Ukraine, and tell you what is really the fact. First untruth is what was Russia's goal in invading Ukraine. You know, as much as they tried to insist, it was not about NATO. You know, NATO, Ukraine, at the time when they invaded in 2014 and took Crimea, took Donbass, Ukraine was a neutral country, and neutrality was written in our constitution. No one, as much as we had wanted to be a part of NATO, nobody was even discussing it with us. It was not an issue at that point. There was no threat coming from Ukraine. And in fact, when we saw that when Sweden and Finland joined NATO and were 501 kilometers from St. Petersburg, it didn't bother Russia because it wasn't about NATO. In fact, NATO encroachment was never an issue. It was never that NATO was moving west. It was that the former East Bloc countries were moving east because of a very well-founded fear of Russian aggression. The goal of Russia was the expansion of a Russian empire. As we know, that in order to remain, empires have to grow. They have to take the resources of their colonies. It was a restoration of the Soviet Union, thus the colonial empire that Russia had. And it was very much Putin trying to stay in power. He did everything from the day he came in to stay in power, including destroying democracy, elections, free press, killing opponents, grabbing the entire economy. And I often laugh when they say Musk is the richest man in the world, because I truly believe that Putin is the richest man in the world, and did everything that he could to destabilize Europe. And indeed, Putin is obsessed with Ukraine. He has a revisionist, imperialist view of history and Ukraine's role in it, and the fact that Ukraine should not exist as a nation. And he considers Ukraine, its independence, its prosperity, a direct threat to his own position. He fears that the Russian people will say, oh, the Ukrainians were just like us, but they're doing better, and they have freedom, they have democracy, they are part of the EU. We want that. And he knows that that will undermine his kleptocratic autocracy that he has created. And so he feels that Ukrainians either have to become Russian, speak Russian, be Russian, or they should not exist. And that is not an exaggeration. It is something they say and write every single day in their media. A second untruth is that the answer is a ceasefire. We have had a lot of experience with treaties with Russia. You know, we were recognized as a separate nation in 1991 after our referendum that had 92%, including all of Crimea, over 50% of Crimea voting for independence. Russia recognized us. Russia recognized our borders in 1997. Putin has often said that he had no intentions because Ukraine is separate. It was written, it was stated, and as we all know, the Budapest Memorandum in '94, where England, France, and Russia came together and said, yes, we recognize Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence. If they give up their largest nuclear weapon, the third largest in the world nuclear weapons, we will guarantee that. We have also had a lot of experience with ceasefires, because during the entire Minsk process, we saw dozens and dozens of violations by Russia of the ceasefire process. We would have a ceasefire, within weeks they would be shooting and killing our people. You know, even our president, Mr. Zelensky, came to power talking about the fact that Poroshenko didn't know what he was doing and that he was going to have a sit down with Putin and talk with him, and he would have a ceasefire. And now he's realized that things are not that simple. Russia knows that the US wants to make a very quick deal, that they need a success. So they will make maximalist demands that will ensure that Ukraine has no army, no way of defending itself, no political or economic autonomy, that it will be completely ruled by Russia, will become Russian-speaking. Its strategic goal is still to destroy us. They will make the maximalist demands. And then when we say no, we will look like the ones who are not agreeing to peace. You know, Ukraine wants peace. We want peace more than anyone. My home is under alarms every single day. We want peace. We have lost friends and family. But we don't want to be destroyed by the peace terms. And, you know, they have, you know, even if Zelensky agreed to some terms, that doesn't say that the people of Ukraine, we are still a democracy, that they would accept that. Because we will continue to fight, because we have been fighting this same war for centuries, and for many of us Ukrainians, my generation, the generation after me, say enough is enough. We want this to end with us, and we do not want it passed on to our children and our grandchildren. A third untruth is that the war is unwinnable, and in fact that Ukraine has no cards. That's not true. We have held off a full-scale invasion for 3 years, despite very inadequate and tardy provision of supplies to us. We have pioneered new tactics and new technology that are now being taught in war colleges around the world. And this year alone, Ukraine hopes to produce 4.5 million drones on our own. And meanwhile, the Russian offensive has been largely stalled. They have had extreme decline in troop quality and quantity. Their troops are exhausted. They're struggling to replace their destroyed equipment and men, to the extent that we have seen in recent weeks men from Russia coming in on crutches. Now, obviously, they can't fight well, so they're just used as targets so that they can find where our positions are. We have seen they're transporting technology on donkeys. Near the hotspot of Chasiv Yar, it has taken them 1 year to take 8 miles. At this rate, it would take about 100 years for them to take Ukraine. In addition, their economy is a mess. They have high inflation, they have high interest rates, and someone said yesterday that the sanctions don't work. Well, they have been working, but if they haven't worked, it's because there is so much of avoidance of the sanctions and so much still coming in and out of Russia that because of contraband. But they still want to extract the minimum from us. You know, and we feel that if we had had the firepower, if we had had the weapons, we could have won. But we held up. We gave time to our neighbors to prepare in case the war spreads further. And now our goal is not to lose. And as I mentioned, we will keep fighting. The people are dedicated to keep fighting. And we strongly feel that nations, it doesn't matter so much how big you are, but it matters on your spirit and your will. And that's why countries like Afghanistan, Vietnam, others were able to overcome much huger powers because of the will of the people who will not stop fighting. You know, we know that the West fears that Russia will lose. Thus, the US is giving Russia, ahead of the negotiations, everything they could possibly want, saying Ukraine will not be in NATO. They will give them G8. They will take away the sanctions. You know, when Putin said 2 days ago, he will be willing to have, a phone call with President Trump is not ruled out. That is very funny because recently there was no phone calls to him at all. He was considered an international pariah who could even not travel anywhere or else he could be arrested by the international courts. And now he is saying that he would not mind a phone call. He is being given, a war criminal is being given legitimacy. And we have seen that in recent days, one of our main bargaining points, Kursk, was given away because we did not have the intelligence, because we did not have that, and they had it. They targeted our soldiers and were able to take back one of the main cities, which, by the way, used to be Ukraine, but is now in Russia. A fourth and final untruth is that the cost of helping Ukraine is just too much for America or Europe. So we say, give Ukraine the confiscated Russian assets so that Ukraine can purchase the weapons and military supplies that it needs. And we want to say that if the cost of us losing will be much, much more. Victory will not satisfy the ambitions of Putin. It will only whet them, and he will go further. And he would then, heaven forbid, if he took Ukraine, use our resources for this broader war, as Hitler used the resources he captured in Czechoslovakia. And so we're warning the world that the world order based on the UN Charter and international law is collapsing, and it's time for strong leadership. You know, we very greatly fear that there may be a Yalta II in the process, which would be very tragic for so many of us, where there would be spheres of influence divided by those with power and with militaries that would divide future resources, future water routes, that would decide what to do with the Arctic, what to do with the Black Sea, what to do with the Panama Canal. This belongs to me, this belongs to you. And might means right. What Ukraine wants is a just and lasting peace with security guarantees that ensure our territorial integrity, our sovereignty, and our independence, that allow us to maintain our identity, our language, and to choose our own future. For us, it's not a question of land. We want our peace to be human-oriented because we know what happens to Ukrainians in the areas that are occupied. They are killed, tortured, filtration camps, raped. They abduct tens of thousands of our children and take them to Russia to be re-educated. They immediately burn our books and bring in new textbooks, new education programs, militarized youth. A peace deal that must thus concentrate not only on the land, which is also important because of the precedent it sets for other countries that are invaded, but also that it will release all our POWs, that all our detained civilians who are being currently tortured, and the return of the tens of thousands of our children. And we're counting on a coalition of leaders around the world to support us in this. And finally, I'd like to say that we are asking everyone who does care about us, don't dictate to us what we should do. Don't get to a table and decide for us what should be us. Ask us, work with us, let us make the decision on how much we are willing to fight to maintain our lives, our freedom, and our choices. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Katya. I think you've clearly laid out for us what the point of view is on the ground and in Ukraine, and thank you. And I think that the point of this panel is you ask, we need leadership, we need people, to help you, and it is the people of the country who determine what the outcome should be. So thank you for that. And so what I want to do is look at, you've laid out, and I think everyone knows and have heard what the U.S. has proposed to do in this situation. But I think we're in Europe. We want to hear what the Europeans want to do. So I want to call on next the former president of Croatia, President Kolinda Grabar-Kitarovic, who knows war and conflict herself from being in a country in former Yugoslavia, but also now as a member of the EU and NATO. What are the Europeans thinking about this, and what kind of security guarantees can the Europeans provide to Ukraine to try to look for a way where we could have a lasting peace and a solution? So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan, and good morning, everyone. Yes, in Croatia, we know war and conflict, but we also know peace, reintegration, and reconciliation, and what a hard process it is. And let me pick up where Kateryna has left off, because I was with her in Ukraine about 2 weeks ago, around the 24th of February. I stayed for about a week, and on the night of the 23rd, I think there were 267 drones, correct me if I'm wrong, Kateryna, sent onto Ukraine, and we spent basically the whole night in the shelters. Yes, and just on to Kyiv. The situation is obviously escalating. So the talk is now ceasefire. Yes, everybody wants to see a break from the war. I think Ukrainians most of all, I hear from people that they want peace. They are tired, they are exhausted. Ukraine has been paying a horrible price for its independence and territorial integrity, but also for protecting the values of international law. So when we talk about ceasefire, I want to underline two crucial conditions or two crucial elements. First, any ceasefire must rest on the postulates of international law, of state sovereignty, territorial integrity, and no changing of borders of any state by force. And this is relevant to all of us. For those who think that a ceasefire or a peace settlement in Ukraine does not concern the rest of us. Well, some of us more than other directly geographically. However, it does concern the global community. It does concern all of us. And again, it concerns the geopolitical order and international law. Second, any ceasefire must break the cycle of Russia's aggression. And Kateryna has spoken to Russia's intentions and goals for quite a long time, so I will not repeat her or repeat myself. So what is the current situation? From what I read from what President Putin said last night, he was walking a very careful, or trying to strike a very careful balance in first reasserting that Russia right now is in a winning position and that they can win not just the territory of Kursk back, but they can make further advances in Ukraine. However, balancing that with being very careful not to enrage President Trump. He knows him personally, and he has actually thanked him for putting so much consideration on the settlement in Ukraine. However, he has also stated that any ceasefire would be to the advantage of Ukraine right now in order to take a break for further fighting. And he also stated that there are very important nuances that need to be discussed if any ceasefire, including the 30-day ceasefire proposed by the American administration and President Trump himself, which has been accepted by Ukraine, if that is to be on the table. And those important nuances that he stated yesterday concern Ukrainian forces in Kursk, which cannot pull out, but they must surrender. But it also, he also said that we must address the original causes of this war, which means not just NATO membership for Ukraine, but future security arrangements for Ukraine. It means also the presence of the so-called West, or NATO, in Eastern and Central European states. And it means basically that the concept of the spheres of influence, which he keeps going back to. So now the relationship between Presidents Trump and Putin. Why does President Trump want the peace so much? So having known both of them and having worked with both of them, but I do admit that in the meantime, they both changed, both President Trump and Putin, in the ways known and unknown to me. But having worked with them, and especially with President Trump, he genuinely cares about human lives. I must say about that. And he wants to bring about the end of the war, of all wars in the world. He thinks that wars are useless and that they're overspending of resources, both defense, financial, human, and other resources. And it was one of his basic campaign promises that he was going to end all the costly wars in the world. Second, as I said, he gets well with President Putin personally. He remembers back into his first term, and now he's come back with a vengeance against everyone whom he thinks had caused harm to him and his re-election at the end of the first term. So he thinks that European leaders mostly snubbed him and that they did not respect him. Most European leaders, not all of them. So he's turning always to the leaders, regardless of ideology, whom he believes can respect and think in the same way that he thinks of these kind of relationships. And looking at the European Union, he thinks that the European Union, that all of us, or most of us, are a bunch of ungrateful allies who had for way too long relied on US power while investing a lot of financial means into paying for cheap gas and energy from Russia, and not investing enough into our own defense. And I do agree with him that, yes, it was us in the EU who had committed to the 2% of the GDP for defense investment back at Wales, and we did not live up to that commitment, or most of the countries did not. Now, most of the countries do live up to that commitment, but now the requirements have gone well above the 2%. And it's true that the European Union has really not invested enough into our own defense capabilities. We wanted to be a global player, but we were not taking care that we had the appropriate capabilities and the resources to do so. So what is ahead for us now to talk about the European Union specifically? I think everybody says for any situation in geopolitical relations like this, it's an inflection point, it's a wake-up call. But I'll go further than that. I'll say that this has been a really kick in the behind of the European Union. Wake up and do something. And there has been a lot of discussion, as you have seen it, among European allies on building our own capabilities, investing more into defense and defense capabilities. Am I very optimistic about that? So, because I have seen many of the European leaders talk amongst themselves. A lot of them propose this is what we have to do. We have to change everything from procurement, which forbids most financial institutions from investing into military, even dual-use technology, to actual plans of what kind of capabilities we need. And when anyone proposes puts a very specific plan on the table, then the response from others is usually, oh, that is too risky. But no risk, no profit. And this is really going to have to work for the EU. So this crisis can be a catalyst for the EU to really develop as a global player. However, we do have to take a very firm position. Now, the relationship between the United States, the European Union, and with Ukraine has to be mended. I don't see that the US can disengage from the European Union and that at this point we can continue to support Ukraine or even provide for our own defenses against countries such as Russia with the current capabilities. Now, successive NATO summits have declared and defined Russia as a long-term direct threat to NATO security. The US obviously has taken a different position right now, and we have seen a realignment, not just between President Trump and Putin on geopolitical issues, but we have also seen that the relationship is getting strained in the economic area with the tariff wars that is currently going on as well. So how do we proceed from here? Being careful, as his own Commerce Secretary Latkin said, when President Trump is unhappy, he responds unhappy. So obviously there will have to be a lot of diplomacy invested into the relationship, but also firmness in protecting the international law, as I said, but also explaining the interconnectivity of what happens in the world and what repercussions it might have on China, and the fact that the United States perceives China as the primary adversary, the primary competitor, and that the biggest fear is channeling the resources into a potential conflict with China. I hope that never, ever happens. So what have I been hearing lately among colleagues? And Kateryna mentioned that. A lot of people are afraid that we're going back not just to the Monroe Doctrine in the United States, so focusing on the Western Hemisphere, but there has been some kind of a deal of spheres of influence. And with NATO Secretary General Rutte visiting the White House yesterday, President Trump, as a matter of fact, said in his presence, oh, this guy should help us get Greenland, because that would be in the interest of NATO. So, you know, these are going to be very interesting time ahead of us. And it's not just Ukraine that Europe is facing. Gaza, Israel, Palestine, things that will be discussed further, but also the Western Balkans and Bosnia and Herzegovina that I suppose my colleagues will focus more about it. What I can say is that we, coming from the region, we cannot disregard the fact that the region has two great potential. One is to do good very quickly, but the second potential is to descend into turmoil very quickly as well. And how to prevent that? I think we're already heading towards some kind of a sticky situation. We're really concerned out of Croatia. But the final resolution has to be the integration of the whole area of the Western Balkans, of Southeast Europe, into the European Union as the only lasting solution. Is Europe ready to do that? Is Europe capable of doing that? Is Europe even aware of the fact that we must focus on the region in order to prevent another war that would distract at least part of the attention from Ukraine as well? I'm not really sure. So there are many unknowns on the table. There is certainly goodwill for the European Union to be able to play a constructive and a catalyst role in not just finding peace and long-lasting settlement in Ukraine, but reaching beyond in other parts of the world. Do we have specific plans? Do we have the courage to do that? I'm, again, not sure, and it does all come back to leadership, to bold, courageous leadership that has to be ready not just to take a risk, but to be able to perhaps overstep some of the boundaries while at the same time protecting the crucial postulates of international law and the relations in this global world. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Madam President. You've given a lot of food for thought and something that I think, we need courageous leadership, but also you've given a lot of good ideas about how perhaps the Europeans should be thinking about how to deal with President Trump and what we could do not to have confrontation, but look for ways that we could come together for the good of not only Ukraine, but the Middle East and beyond. So I think now I'd like to turn to former President of Montenegro, President Dukanovic, who again is a member of NATO. I said you were president of NATO, I meant Montenegro. And what your thoughts are, because you're also in the region, you also have been susceptible to the influence or maybe the malinfluence of Russia, and what are your thoughts on how we can move forward?
Hvala vam na prilici da budem dio ovog panela i hvala vam na inspirativnoj temi namijenjenoj mojem uključivanju. Vjerujem da smo do sada čuli više nego ubjedljivu prezentaciju slike iz jednog od dva ključna krizna regiona u svijetu u ovom periodu i također vrlo zanimljivo razmišljanje o tome gdje je Europa u kontekstu aktuelnih geopolitičkih promjena. Geopolitičke promjene su, čini mi se, vrlo važan aspekt za razumijevanje problema koji je danas na dnevnom redu. Aktuelne geopolitičke promjene, koliko očekivane, jednako su i šokantne. Kad kažem očekivane, rekao bih za najpovršnije političke analitičare onoga što se događa posljednjih deceniju, dvije, očekivano je da dolazi do geopolitičkog prestrojavanja nakon sve očiglednije krize u koju je upao geopolitički model konstituisan nakon završetka hladnog rata, geopolitički model monopola jedne supersile. A šokantne su zbog posljedica koje te geopolitičke promjene donose. Dakle, te geopolitičke promjene očigledno prijete da sasvim sruše međunarodno pravo i da apsolutno uruše nešto što je multilateralna arhitektura na kojoj je počivao razvoj demokratije u svijetu poslije Drugog svjetskog rata. Rekao bih da manje iznenađenja dolazi iz istočne političke hemisfere. Osim snažnog rasta Kine i osim vrlo rastuće konkurentnosti Kine, teško da bismo još nešto mogli pomenuti kao iznenađenje, svejedno prijatno ili neprijatno sa istoka. Rekao bih da živimo u vremenu u kojem se svakodnevno porađa sve veći nered u zapadnoj političkoj hemisferi. Dakle, mi danas, nažalost, svjedočimo tome da se u onome što smatramo euroatlantskom civilizacijom, a dolazim sa jedne adrese koja je ne samo formalno dio NATO saveza, nego je, rekao bih, historijski, geografski dio Europe. Mi svjedočimo, rekao bih, potpunom urušavanju vrijednosti na kojim je euroatlantska civilizacija gradila svoju superiornost u periodu nakon Drugog svjetskog rata. Svjedočimo slobodnom padu kvaliteta politike u Europi i u Americi. Ne zato što se u međuvremenu pojavile neke superiornije vrijednosti sa istoka ili sa bilo koje druge strane svijeta, nego prosto zato što smo mi, rekao bih, se umorili od odbrane svojih vrijednosti i što smo, nažalost, dozvolili da danas se naša politika prepoznaje kao nedosljedna, nedovoljno borbena, nedovoljno posvećena vrijednosti na kojima je ona nastala. Zato mislim da je danas trenutak u kojem moramo zaista ozbiljno razmisliti kuda dalje. Dakle, meni se čini da posljedica koja prijeti jeste da je danas sve više ljudi u demokratskom svijetu koji počinju da vjeruju da je rješenje aktuelnih problema i rješenje naraslih protivurječnosti u tome da demokratski modeli upravljanja budu zamijenjeni autokratskim modelima upravljanja. Kao da danas sve više sumnjamo u to da je ispravno da građanima pripada njihova sloboda i da im pripada zaštita ljudskih prava, a da bi umjesto toga o tome trebali da brinu njihovi efikasni autokratski lideri. Dakle, kao da sve više počinjemo da ličimo na ono vrijeme 30. godina prošlog vijeka, kada su ljudi bili impresionirani populističkim liderima koji su imali naoko laka i održiva rješenja za sve probleme sa kojima se svijet suočava. A znali smo, naravno i danas znamo iz tog iskustva, da je zapravo to jedna teška iluzija i da to vodi slomu. Dakle, ja smatram da ne bismo smjeli nipošto dozvoliti kao demokratski svijet da danas padamo u atmosferu da je ovom svijetu potreban novi šerif. Dakle, danas je krenula licitacija oko toga da li je neko u svijetu prepoznao da je stigao novi šerif u gradu. I dok bismo mogli sa tim oko toga da diskutujemo, kada bismo percepciju grada sveli samo na jedan grad ili samo na jednu državu, mi govorimo o tome da bi se pod tim gradom mogao podrazumijevati čitav demokratski svijet. I morali bi se zapitati zapravo da li je rješenje u tome da prepoznamo novog šerifa i da se prepustimo njegovim čudima. To je osnovno pitanje za demokratski svijet. Dakle, da li smo mi sebi dozvolili da zgazimo vrijednosti na kojima smo izgradili svoju superiornost i da li se danas sve veći broj lidera iz tog dijela svijeta utrkuje da preuzme pravila autokratskog rješavanja protivurječnosti u svijetu. Ja tu vidim glavne opasnosti. Dakle, zbog toga, nažalost, mi danas imamo situaciju u kojoj imamo ovakve nejasnoće u okviru samog euroatlantskog političkog prostora. Mi danas imamo naraslo nepovjerenje o kojem je govorila predsjednica Grabar-Kitarovic na relaciji Evropa-Amerika. I mi danas plašim se jednostavno da smo zapali u ćorsokak iz kog ne vidimo gdje je izlaz. Izlaz mora biti naravno u očuvanju Euroatlantskog saveza. Euroatlantski savez je savez koji je zasnovan na identičnosti vrijednosti. Zbog toga je to bio pouzdan savez, zbog toga je to bio savez koji je poslije Drugog svjetskog rata garantovao prestiž ne samo državama euroatlantskog prostora, nego je garantovao prosperitet svijetu u cjelini. Dakle, ja smatram da smo danas na zapadnoj političkoj hemisferi zaista u ozbiljnom političkom ćorsokaku i da mi moramo pokušati da iz toga što brže vidimo izlaz. Jer jedino na taj način možemo doprinijeti i sebi i svojoj konkurentnosti i na taj način možemo doprinijeti stabilnosti i prosperitetu svijeta u cjelini.
Well, Mr. President, I agree with you that we have kind of come to a place where we have to make some very hard decisions about the importance of the Euro-Atlantic relationship and what that means to our democratic values and to the world. So I think this isn't exactly right on the time there, but we've looked at now the crisis, the war in Ukraine, what that means for Europe. But now I'd like to switch and talk a little bit about the Middle East and what's happening in Israel and Gaza. And I want to start out with having Dr. Ismail Serageldin speak first as a citizen of Egypt and an Arab man. I would like him to discuss his thoughts. Also, someone who's not only been the co-chair of the NGIC, but worked at the World Bank, so understands the importance of international organizations for the world order. So, Dr. Serageldin.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. We are, of course, confronting some very old problems, but in a new garb. In a sense, of course, the problems of the Middle East, the rights of the Palestinians, and from the time of 1948 and the first Nakba, and all these things are well known, and I'm not going to go into any of that history, but I believe that a lot of us were hoping that in the light of all that happened, we would have moved towards a two-state solution. And that was not the case. And as a result of that, there had been, of course, a number of issues, but the most important of which was the October 7th attack that really triggered an enormous reaction on the side of Israel. And the Netanyahu government then has been raging a war on Gaza for over 500 days, in which 40,000 people have been killed, if not more. 70,000 or more have been wounded. There's been almost a total destruction. Hunger, violence, etc. has existed. There are criticisms about whether collective punishment, whether withholding humanitarian aid or not, results in a series of war crimes. And there is a warrant that has been issued by the ICC, which is not likely right now to be in any way enforced. But now, the next step that came up most recently is the proposal for massive ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from the territories, starting territories in Gaza. And that, of course, the plan that Mr. Trump had put forward and Mr. Netanyahu seems to have accepted would require the massive ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, which incidentally, again, is classified as a war crime. And as a result of the rejection of that plan by practically everybody, the Arab countries have put forward a plan for the reconstruction of Gaza, with the Palestinians remaining there through a series of staged operations that will enable them not only to stay, but in fact to rebuild schools and hospitals and infrastructure and find them ports and employment, and proposals for funding that from many sources, including the Arab countries, of course, was very upfront. It was promptly rejected by President Trump and his administration and by the Netanyahu administration. Even though, for example, voices like the established Washington Post adopted it and said it's a very reasonable plan and it should be pursued. And so we are now at this moment where what is going to happen next is very controversial, because not only do we have UNRWA has been dismantled, but in fact, the humanitarian aid to Gaza is also being blocked at this moment as we speak. And against that background, I know I'm reminded of a very famous Irish poem by Yeats, who said, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." The worst are being full of passionate intensity. We see a lot of that around. But then I have, in the midst of all this, a voice of reason and hope brought me new light, and I would like to specifically point out to Prime Minister Olmert. Prime Minister Olmert, not only when he was in power, made some very reasonable offers on dealing with how to share the Palestinian land. He also appeared recently in a program with Christian Amanpour with Nasser al-Qidwa, who was the foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority under Yasser Arafat. And they were reviving the two-state solution. And it was a voice of reason, even though it was being challenged by all sides, but it was a voice of reason that followed in a track of earlier reasonable proposals that he had made. And I believe at the time also Tzipi Livni was your Minister of Foreign Affairs, if I'm not mistaken. So there we hope that we can revive that proposal in the light of what is going on today? That is a good question for us to start from, because the war and the killing must stop, the rebuilding must start, but the rebuilding must have a purpose and a hope. And it cannot be Mr. Trump's Riviera on Gaza that is the proposal with massive ethnic cleansing of millions of Palestinians, which would be classified as a war crime almost anywhere. So do we have hope? Yes, it's important to note that the reconstruction plan, peace plan, that has been put forward by the Arab countries has been supported by the Organization of Islamic Conference, the 57 countries, 22 countries of the Arab League. Many, many people already from Europe have expressed support for that. And the question then remains, let's assume that we can even get agreement on the rebuilding process and the steps it will take, the jobs it will create, the new facilities that will have to be added in Gaza. What can we look forward in terms of the rights of the Palestinians? And here, as I said, I was very pleasantly impressed by Prime Minister Olmert's with Nasser al-Qidwa speaking about reviving the two-state solution at a time when many were losing hope. So I would invite further discussion on what can we do to address the core issues which your proposal would address, Mr. Prime Minister, and also deal with the needs of the Palestinian people. You cannot block humanitarian aid. You cannot forbid assistance to people in dire straits. Otherwise, we lose all sense of values of our humanities. And I would end by quoting a lady that I admire when she said, this Carrie Chapman Catt, who said, "To the wrongs that need resistance, to the right that needs assistance, to the future in the distance, let us commit ourselves." Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think that is a good lead-in to our next speaker, who is former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert. And we're eager to hear. This is what the Baku Forum is all about, to hear about points of view and good ideas that we hope that our current leaders will adopt. So, Mr. Prime Minister, we could turn the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. For the sake of transparency, I think it's significant for me to emphasize something which may be obvious, but still I need to mention it. I don't speak for the state of Israel on these days, and I don't speak for the government of Israel. In the event that someone may be mistaken, I don't support this government, and I'm one of the most sharpest oppositioners to the policies and the leadership of this government. So that has to be clear. The war in Gaza became unavoidable when, on the 7th of October, 2023. I don't remember in recent modern history anything similar to what took place on the 7th of October. A very brutal, atrocious killing that was aimed from the beginning against innocent civilians. We have a history of fightings between us and our countries. Thank God, with two very important, the most important Arab country, Egypt, we have peace for more than 40 years, and we have peace with Jordan. While we kept fighting with Palestinians and with the Hezbollah in the north and with the Syrians for many years. Mostly there was armies against armies. What was on the 7th of October was something entirely different. It was brutal, it was cruel, it was inhuman. It was unforgettable and unforgivable. And the counteroffensive of Israel was unavoidable. the entire international community, I think, at that time, starting with President Biden, was a great friend of the State of Israel and a great supporter. And the British Prime Minister and the French President and the German Chancellor and so many others across the world said Israel has the right to reach out for the Palestinians that committed these crimes, the Hamas leaders. I must say that when they said it, and they kept repeating it, and I remember Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was not a traditional associate of the State of Israel for many years, stood up in Israel and was asked, and he said, I will not say to the Israelis, stop, because they have a right to continue until they reach out for everyone. And all those that supported the Israeli operation knew that the Hamas is embedded in the most densely populated area in the world, amongst the citizens, the innocent citizens, and 99.9% of the Palestinians living in Gaza are innocent people. There is no question about it. Never was. And yet all the Hamas people which were embedded there brought about the almost inevitable outcome, which is the killing of so many Palestinians that were not part of terror, are not part of terror, and I don't think want to be part of terror. So the outcome, the disaster, the humanitarian crisis which took place there was almost an inevitable outcome of the initial brutal attack against Israeli civilians that caused, of course, the assassination, the murder of more than 1,200 people. Most of them are civilians in the bedrooms, in the living rooms, in the safe rooms, in the houses, not in military camps. Now, having said all that, the main question which I looked at and I spelled it out long time ago, more than a year, was, okay, let's assume that we succeed in what we set out to do, which was very important, to destroy Hamas. Let's assume that we will succeed more than was anticipated by most, that we will reach out for every single Hamas fighter and kill him, and he deserved to be killed, because he was set out to kill people in the most brutal manner. And there will be no Hamas anymore. We still have 2.5 million Palestinians living in Gaza and 3.5 million people, the Palestinians living in the West Bank. And the main question is, okay, what are we up for? Where do we go from there? What do we have in mind doing? How are we prepared to build up the relations between us and the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank to change realities which has characterized the Middle East for such a long time? Unfortunately, my government didn't have the integrity, didn't have the revision, didn't have the inspiration to propose what will be the end game, what will be the next step. And of course, for the majority of Israelis, already long time ago, but certainly, definitely in the last few months, the most important objective is to help bring back all the Israeli hostages still abducted and held by the Hamas at any cost. I repeat, at any cost. Which means, inevitably, the end of the war and the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. I don't want to go into global politics. I heard what was said about the new sheriff in the context of Russia and Ukraine, and something that it may apply as well to the Middle East. I don't know. I think it's too early to judge what will be the outcome of some of the proposals and statements. I can say clearly, explicitly, and without any hesitation, I'm against the deportation of Palestinians from Gaza. Not only because it will not work, not only because it is not practical, but also because it is not moral. And I think that the position that was held by some people speaking from Israel does not represent the fundamental moral values of what Israel is all about. We are against the deportations of people from Gaza. We are against trying to change Gaza into some kind of a resort place for some rich investors. It will not work. It will only aggravate the conflict, the historical pains, and the suffering of thousands and millions of people. So what shall we do? As I said already almost a year ago, I thought then that Israel achieved most of what could be achieved by a military operation. The military operation of Israel, regrettably, with all the suffering of many innocent Palestinians that were killed, was, from a military point of view, a very successful and very effective. Hamas, practically, in terms of a military power, has been destroyed. The leaders of Hamas were eliminated, and rightly so. And Hamas is not, at this point, an imminent threat to the security of the state of Israel. We can handle it, we can deal with it. We don't have to be there. We ought to leave Gaza for the Palestinians and the Arabs because it's theirs and not ours. And that's what we were aiming at when in 2005, under the leadership of Prime Minister Sharon at that time, we decided to disengage from Gaza. And Minister Livni and myself at that time were ministers in the cabinet of Sharon, and we advocated it, and we fought for it, and we battled against the opposition in order to pull out Israel entirely from Gaza. And we don't need to stay there now as well. We have to pull out. But there ought to be an arrangement that needs to be worked out carefully, and I'm not certain that the Egyptian proposal and the Arab League proposal, which in principle is positive and in the right direction, covers all the different aspects of what needs to be done in Gaza. Particularly, I think, the effort to remove Hamas completely from any position of dominance in Gaza, because in as long as Hamas will be dominant in Gaza, there will not be peace, there will not be end or cessation of hostilities, and it will continue to shake the foundations of stability in this part of the world. So the basic strategy that I advocate, and as was said here before, I made a joint statement, first time perhaps in, I think since Oslo, that two prominent representatives, not official representatives, but two well-known personalities, Dr. Nasser al-Kidwa, the former foreign minister and ambassador to the United Nations, and also not insignificant, the nephew of Arafat, and myself, published a joint statement that were focused on three issues, which I think should be at the basis of everything that we're trying to do in the future. One is the end of the war in Gaza. There should be a new governing body that will have to be linked to the Palestinian Authority, made up of Palestinians that will have the authority, the power, the means to change the government in Gaza altogether. It is not simple. It is complex. It requires a participation of the Palestinians and of the Arab countries, but it is possible. The next, of course, is to build up a security force made up of Palestinians, of Egyptians, of Jordanians, of the Emirate soldiers, of Saudis, that will take over the security for an interim period that will be determined according to circumstances, but that will prevent the resurrection of Hamas as a military and political power in Gaza. And of course, the end of the war has to start immediately in one phase of the return of all the hostages. There will be a release of Palestinian prisoners as part of an agreement, and Israel will have to end the war and to pull out completely from Gaza when the security force of the Arab countries and Palestinians will take over, and possibly also with the participation of some Europeans. I know that when we talk about the participation of Europeans in the military security force in Gaza, it sounds strange and queer, and some people say it's impossible. I heard these words when Tzipi and myself in 2006 say that there will have to be an international security force in Lebanon, and there was an international security force made of European soldiers, and it was effective for a few years, and it deterred the partly as a result of the war itself in 2006, the Hezbollah from attacking Israel for many, many years. So this is something that can be done, ought to be done, and should be done in Gaza. But one of the most important elements that unfortunately was not treated in a meticulous manner by the Egyptian and the Arab League plan is the removal of Hamas from any dominance in Gaza, military and political, as a prerequisite for a dramatic change that will allow the resurrection and the rebuilding with an international effort of many countries of Gaza that will be worthy for the 2.5 million people living there to live in a decent manner. Now, what I think is inevitable in this process is also to embark on the serious negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians in order to solve once and for all the historic conflict between us and them. And my joint statement with Dr. Al-Kidwa covers it. I know that some people say, how can you even think that after the 7th of October there is a chance for a two-state solution? And I keep asking all the time, what is the alternative? If one person has the vision and the understanding that he can provide us with a solution that is different, please let me know. I'm not familiar with anyone. There can be all kinds of partial arrangements of deportation, of expulsion, of autonomy, of many other queer ideas. A solution, there is only one, two-state, Palestine and the State of Israel. And what we propose, and this is a document signed by him and by me, and was presented to, in many countries, to the European Union and to others across the world and to Arab countries, is that there will be a Palestinian state based on the 67 borders with minor changes of annexation of some part and an equal-sized swaps of territories that were part of the State of Israel, so that the basis of the Palestinian state will be the 67 borders. We also proposed, and this is signed by the two of us, this is not just a statement, it's a commitment, that the part of Jerusalem that was never part of the State of Israel prior to 67 will be the capital of the Palestinian state. This is the first time, it was the first time that I proposed it to the President of the Palestinian Authority in 2008, but this is the first time that such a proposal again is signed and declared publicly by two well-known representatives in unofficial positions from both sides, Palestinians and the State of Israel. We also propose that the old city of Jerusalem will not be under the sovereignty of any country. There will never be peace in as long as there will be one flag over the Temple Mount, not Palestinian and not Israeli. And what we proposed was that there will be a 5 nations trust of which Palestine and Israel will be part, that will be in charge of administering the old city of Jerusalem for all believers, with free access to all the holy sites, but without one exclusive political sovereignty. There will never be peace if there will be only a Palestinian flag on the Temple Mount, disregarding the historical dimensions that are so significant for the Jewish people. And there will not be peace if there will be only an Israeli flag on the Temple Mount, disregarding the historical dimensions and the religious sensitivities of the Muslim people to the Temple Mount. So there should be a trust of 5 nations, neither us nor the Palestinians in exclusive positions. And there are many other problems. We didn't invent the wheel, we didn't propose a detailed program and plan, but there is a set of principles which characterize and represent the ideas that we think are important and relevant and significant for the future. To sum it up, I want to say this. And I have to say it because I think that this is kind of closing a circle and presenting the full historical perspective of it. Israel is being accused for good reasons, by the way, okay? And I'm part of it, of what it is not doing and hasn't been doing and is not prepared to do in keeping with the needs to resolve the conflict. But in 2008, I, as a Prime Minister of the State of Israel, with a full majority in Parliament and in the public opinion, I presented this plan. And in our joint statement, Dr. Al-Kidwa signs that what we propose now follows what I proposed in 2008 to the Palestinian leadership. A comprehensive peace treaty, 2-state, based on the 67 borders, with a changed status of part of Jerusalem to become the Palestinian capital, with a removal of the one exclusive sovereignty over the old city so that it will be shared by all. All this was proposed by the State of Israel to the Palestinian leadership in 2008. Had then the Palestinian leadership had the courage, the vision, the determination, and the leadership to sign, life would have been different already for tens of millions of people in our region and maybe even beyond. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, and I think you really have given me hope that perhaps there can be a 2-state solution, and thank you very much for your comments. And I'd like to turn it over now to Foreign Minister Livni, who I hope can give me her thoughts on what she thinks is the way forward to end the conflict. And I would just tell the panelists that this number on the screen is not correct. I don't think they added the 15 minutes to our panel because we have until 11:30, so we have about 15 more minutes. So, Madam Minister, go ahead.
No wonder that Prime Minister Olmert and me were at the same government, him as a Prime Minister, I'm as a Foreign Minister, supporting 2 states for 2 peoples, initiating peace process when he was in office, and he was just sharing with you what was offered to the Palestinians, and later I was there in another government in 2014, offering the Palestinians with the American administration basically the same or quite similar to Olmert proposals, and unfortunately, and bad news for both our peoples, we didn't get any answer. And I'm saying that because I don't think that the right thing to do is to enter into a blame game, but we should think how we can move forward. But I would like this audience and others to understand that while you were thinking, or maybe some are thinking in terms of one side are the Palestinians and on the other Israelis, and who is right and who is wrong, this is a wrong way to discuss the situation. Because on both sides, there are more moderates, pragmatics, believing in 2 states for 2 peoples. And there are those that represent some, I don't know, religious ideology, are not willing to compromise on anything. For some Israelis, it's called Greater Israel between the river and the sea. And for Palestinians, it calls from the river to the sea, free Palestine. And you can see now people, Israelis and Palestinians, walking with the same medallions, the same map between the river and the sea. And this brings us back to 1947, before the United Nations declared and offered the partition plan in order to end the conflict between the river and to the sea based on two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. But it's not too late. And of course, October 7 changed some of my friends, peace supporters, about the feasibility to achieve peace. But I would like to focus on certain things that are important now, because time works against those believing in two states for two peoples. Unfortunately, and to my frustration, the Israeli government and the United States administration, the foreign, didn't succeed in putting a plan for the day after, which is here and now, on the table that can change realities on the ground for a better future for Palestinians and Israelis alike. And it's needed to be done now because when time passes by, when some of Israelis, as Mo mentioned, are dreaming about this Trump plan, that, by the way, is changing it during every day. He tried to portray this in a more soft manner, something that will not happen, but while people are waiting, there is no vacuum. And Hamas remain in power. And this is something that acts against all of those believing in two states for two peoples, because we need to reiterate. In 2005, Israel left Gaza Strip. On October 6th, there was no one Israeli settler, was no one Israeli soldier within Gaza Strip. In 2006, when Hamas won the election, Prime Minister Olmert and I convinced the international community, and all together, they put the parameters of the quartet on the table, saying that any Palestinian government, including Hamas, can be legitimate, and Gaza can be completely open to the world with airports and seaports, as long as Hamas would accept three requirements. Not very difficult for those of us believing in peace. Renounce violence and terrorism, accept the right of Israel to exist, and abide to Oslo Agreement, the peace treaty between Israel and the Palestinians. And therefore, Hamas, these are not the freedom fighters fighting for a Palestinian state. In order to free Gaza, they should have and could have accepted these requirements, renounce violence and terrorism, instead of executing this horrific attack on Israel on October 7th. And I'm saying it because I believe that now there are opportunities. And the opportunities are that also most of world leaders understand that Hamas cannot stay as a regime. And rightly so. We acted against its military capabilities, infrastructure, and unfortunately there are lots of civil casualties also on the Palestinian side. But if Hamas remains in power as a regime, and they will re-strengthen themselves and get the money that the international community will offer to the people in Gaza in order to build more tunnel or buy more weapons, those that will suffer will be, yes, Israelis, but also the Palestinians. And we cannot afford, and we don't want that this war will turn into just another round. And next thing will be Hamas in power, they will target Israel, we will answer with another military operation, and all of us and prospects for peace will disappear. And therefore, what needs to be done is the following. Yes, release of the hostages, an agreement that Hamas cannot stay in power, re-legitimizing and even rebuilding the Palestinian Authority as representative of the Palestinians. They represent a conflict with Israel, but it's a national conflict. National conflicts are solvable. And as was offered also in the past, religious conflict, this jihadist ideology is unsolvable because they are not fighting for a legitimate cause of the Palestinians, they are fighting against the mere existence of the State of Israel. And then it's not just giving the keys to the Palestinian Authority, which unfortunately also too weak, also due to the policy of the current Israeli government that both of us do not represent here, but also with the support and strengthening by the Arab world, maybe Arab forces that will join, the possibility of Israel to act against terror with cooperation of the new Palestinian, not terrorist regime that will take over Gaza, with other regional stakeholders. Egypt has an important role on the border between Gaza and Egypt. The Emirates can contribute to that as well, with reforms on the Palestinian Authority as part of this request. Hopefully, giving, and I'm not saying that this can happen as a replacement to two states for two peoples. No way. This is part of the way toward the implementation of two states for two peoples, as giving an answer to national aspiration of different peoples, Israel for the Jewish people and the Palestinian state for the Palestinians. And if the Saudis join, or if this political horizon will be explicitly said and supported by an Israeli government, I don't think that the current Israeli government will adopt it, then the Saudis also can enter and we can build a new security regime. I also believe we are here in Baku that Azerbaijan can have a role because of its very good friendly relations with Israel, supporting Israel's security on one hand, on the other having a very special strategic relations with Turkey, given the situation in Syria and given also the relations with Azerbaijan, with other Muslim countries. It can be part of supporting this new strategic, hopefully, new strategic security alliance for the region. It should be, of course, led by the United States, and I believe that if they will focus on this and on the vision that we share here on the stage, but as we said before, not everybody supports it in Israel, nor on the Palestinian side. But since we started this discussion speaking about the transatlantic alliance, it was all about understanding that this is an alliance of set of values, not only just shared interest, but shared values. So let's implement it also regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I would say moderates of the region unite. And if we do so, we have some hope for the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Minister Livni, and also Minister Olmert, because I think at least you've given me some hope for a way forward and a solution, which I think this is part of what the Baku Forum is all about, for people to hear other people's points of view and not assume that everyone in a country shares the views of the current leadership. I think this is true in the United States as well. So I want to now move to Mr. Let's see here, Arinc, because I want to talk a little bit about the role of Turkey. Turkey is a NATO ally. Turkey also, I think, is in a strategic position to not only influence and has tried to make peaceful solutions to the conflict in Ukraine, but also I think can play a role in the Middle East. So I'll turn the conversation over to you, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about the role that Turkey envisions playing.
Çok teşekkür ederim. Değerli panelistlere ve katılımcılara saygılar sunuyorum. Gününüz hayır olsun. Konuşmamı Türkçe yapacağım. Öncelikle böyle bir oturumda, böyle bir forumda bulunmak benim için büyük bir mutluluk. Geçen yıllarda katılamamıştım. Ben 1995'ten sonra 25 yıla yakın Türkiye Parlamentosu'nda milletvekilliği, 5 yıl meclis başkanlığı, 7 yıldan fazla da başbakan yardımcılığı ve hükümet sözcülüğü yaptım. Şimdi emekli sayıyorum kendimi ama siyasetle ilgim devam ediyor. Bu uzun süre içerisinde pek çok diplomatla, pek çok siyasetçiyle, devlet adamıyla tanıştım ve görüştüm. Bunlardan ikisi yanımda bulunuyor. Birisi Sayın Olmert, birisi de Sayın Livni. Benim başkanlık veya başbakan yardımcılığım döneminde onlar da İsrail'de önemli görevlerde bulunuyorlardı. İkisini de takdir etmiştim. Bugünkü konuşmalarıyla da bu takdirlerimde ne kadar haklı olduğumu gördüm. Kendilerine de teşekkür ediyorum. Yine Ukrayna'da Yushchenko'yu bilirim. Herhalde değerli eşleri burada hazır bulunuyorlar. Ukrayna ile de özel ilişkilerim oldu. Yushchenko'yu da, Yanukovic'i de, Timoşenko'yu da bilirim, tanırım. Maydan meydanına gitmişliğim vardır. Tabii orayla, Kırım dolayısıyla da daha sonraki Rusya'nın bu haksız savaşında da iç içe oldum. Meclis başkanlığımdan sonra bir sürede Karadeniz Ekonomik İşbirliği Parlamenter Asamblesi'nin başkanlığını yapmıştım. Orada 12 ülke var ama 3 büyük ülke diyebileceğimiz Rusya, Ukrayna ve Türkiye'nin başat rolünü unutmayalım. Dolayısıyla Ukrayna'nın kendi içerisindeki siyasi istikrarsızlığını, çatışmalarını ve 3 yıldan bu yana da Rusya'nın haksız bir şekilde şehirleri bombalayarak, insanları öldürerek neler yaptığını üzüntüyle ve yakından takip ettim. Tabii bir taraftan Filistin'de olanlar, Gazze'de yaşananlar canlı tanıklarıyla anlatılıyor. Bir taraftan da Ukrayna ile Rusya savaşındaki gelinen durum ortaya konuyor. Buraya gelirken şunu düşündüm. Bir defa Birinci Dünya Savaşı'nı, İkinci Dünya Savaşı'nı yaşamış bir dünyadan bahsediyoruz. Milyonlarca insan öldü. Ama 45'ten sonra, yani 1945'i kastediyorum, Truman doktriniyle 1947'de bir soğuk savaş dönemi başladı. Bu hemen hemen 1991'e kadar devam etti. Yani Amerika ve Rusya'nın başını çektiği gruplar birbirlerine karşıdan bağırıp çağırarak sıcak savaşın şartlarına ulaşmadan bazen de vekalet savaşlarıyla bu işi götürdüler. Şimdi belki ikinci soğuk savaş döneminden sonra gerçek savaşın yaşandığı günlerin içindeyiz ve bu çok büyük bir üzüntü verici. Hatta bu savaş tehlikesi o kadar yakınımıza ulaştı ki işte Azerbaycan'la Ermenistan arasında geçtiğimiz yıllarda yaşananlar ve Sayın Aliyev bu forumun açılış konuşmasında yine bir endişeden bahsetti ve doğrudan Fransa'yı suçladı. Fransa Ermenistan'ın tarafını tutmaya devam ederse sanki bu savaş devam edecek gibi görünüyor dedi. Değerli dostlar, hemen yanı başımızda Gazze bize uzak değil, Suriye bize uzak değil, Irak'ta yaşananları, özellikle Amerika'nın işgalinden sonra meydana gelenleri ve orada örgütlerin yani aşırıcıların neler yaptıklarını çok iyi biliyorum. 15 gün evvel de Kuzey Irak'ta Erbil'de bir forumda konuşmacıydım. Orada yaşananları, konuşulanları da az çok biliyorum. Söylemek istediklerimi şöyle toparlayarak ifade edeyim. Zamanın geçtiğinin farkındayım ama çok güzel görüşmeler yapıldı. Bir defa dünya böyle bir zorluklar içerisinde yaşamayı hak etmiyor. Bunun sebebi belki etnik farklılıklar olabilir. Terörü meydana getiren ana sebepler olabilir. İşgal durumunda bulunan haksız bir şekilde eski iddialarını tekrarlamak olabilir. Böyle durumlarda genelde İkinci Dünya Savaşı'ndan sonra kurulan örgütlerin çok faal ve etkili olması lazım. Mesela Birleşmiş Milletler'i ele alalım. Hepimiz bunun üyesiyiz. Birleşmiş Milletler bu ülkeler arasındaki sorunlara dur diyebilecek en etkili organ gibi görünüyor. Burada yine en etkili organ diyebileceğimiz BM'nin, United Nations'ın Güvenlik Konseyi var. Özellikle sıcak savaş durumunda, çatışma durumunda, kriz döneminde Güvenlik Konseyi'nin devreye girmesi ve burada dur demesi lazım. Bir mahkeme kurmadan önce bir dur bakalım demesi lazım. Ama Güvenlik Konseyi kararı almak bile çok zor. Özellikle veto hakkı bulunan ülkeler kendi çıkarlarına uygun olmayan kararlara karşı veto hakkını rahatlıkla kullanabiliyorlar. Tercümeden memnun muyuz? Arkadaşımız tercüme edebiliyor değil mi? Teşekkürler. Güvenlik Konseyi'nde bazen Amerika veto hakkını rahatlıkla kullanıyor. Hiç de yüzü kızarmadan. Bazen Rusya, bazen Fransa, bazen başkası. 5 ülke üyenin, yani konseyde söz sahibi olan ülkenin veto hakkını sorumsuzca kullanmasının büyük bir sorun olduğunu düşünüyorum. Bunu en güzel şekilde Türkiye Cumhurbaşkanı ifade etti. En az 4-5 seneden bu yana dünya 5'ten büyüktür diyor. Güzel bir motto oldu. Dünya 5'ten büyüktür. Neden? Çünkü 192 ülke var. Bunların içerisinde hemen hemen küçük, büyük her şey var. Ama birisinin veto hakkı her şeyi geçersiz kılabiliyor. Biz buna karşı durmalıyız. Birleşmiş Milletler'in ana kuruluşunu değiştirmenin bir oydaşma ile ancak mümkün olabileceğini de biliyorum. Ama bu gerçeği ifade etmek bile bazılarına ağır geliyor. Hayır, dünya 5'ten büyüktür diyeceksek bunun sebepleri gayet güzel ortada. İsrail hakkında onlarca Birleşmiş Milletler kararı var. Bunların hiçbirisi uygulanmıyor. Uygulanması için bir mekanizma yok. Güçlü bir mekanizma yok. Yani bunu mecbur edebilecek bir sistemin içerisinde değiliz. Uzatmayacağım, Avrupa Konseyi var. Türkiye Avrupa Konseyi'nin de kurucu üyesidir. Avrupa Konseyi'nin de elinde çok büyük imkanlar var. Bu imkanları her zaman için kullanabilir. Ama kullanmıyor, kullanamıyor. Kullanılamaz hale getiriliyor. Örnek mi isterseniz? İşte 1990'lı yılların başında Ermenistan'ın bu topraklardan Karabağ başta olmak üzere pek çok yeri haksız bir şekilde işgal etmesi, insanları öldürmesi, Hocalı katliamında yaşananlar bir soykırımdır, bunların yapılması. Soykırım kelimesini kullanmaktan imtina ediyoruz. Çünkü Türkiye hakkında da bu gelişigüzel kullanılmıştır. Ama katliamlar yaşanmıştır. Srebrenica'da, Bosna'da yaşanan gerçekten Birleşmiş Milletler kararına göre de bir soykırımdır. Bütün bunların yaşandığı bir zamanda konseyin yapabildiği şey Minsk grubu diye sorunu barışçı yoldan çözebilecek bir grubun oluşturulması oldu. Ama unutmayalım, sorunun sebebi olanlar sorunu çözmekten kaçıyorlar. Minsk grubunun içerisinde bulunan ülkelerden tahmin edebileceğiniz bir ikisi bunu fonksiyonsuz hale getirdi. 30 yıl geçti belki üzerinden, Minsk grubundan bir ses bile çıkmadı. Şimdi artık Azerbaycan haklı olarak diyor ki, ben güç kullandım, hakkımı savundum ve işgal altında olan bütün toprakları kurtardım. Şimdi Ermenistan'la bir barış anlaşması yapılacaksa, siz Ermenistan'ı zorlayın ki bir barışa doğru gidelim. Artık Minsk grubunun geçerliliği kalmamıştır diyor. Ben de aynı fikirdeyim. Bütün bunları şunun için söylüyorum. Avrupa İnsan Hakları Sözleşmesi var. Avrupa İnsan Hakları Mahkemesi var. Bütün bu kurumlar, Lahey'de başka şeyler var. Fonksiyonlarını tam ifa etmeli. Hiç bunların dışında bir örgüt daha söyleyeyim. Dünya Sağlık Örgütü diyelim mesela. Covid, yani daha önce başımızın büyük bir belası olan salgın hastalık zamanında bütün bunlarla ilgilenmesi gereken kurumlardan Amerika bir şekilde kendisini çekeceğini söylüyor. Özellikle Trump'ın bu yeni döneminde ve geçmiş döneminde artık NATO'dan da, belki Birleşmiş Milletler'den de, belki bir başka yerden de çıkacağım, bunlara para bile vermeyeceğim diyor. Trump'ın bu son gelişi, Türkiye'de bir benzetme vardır. Bilmiyorum tercüman yeterince tanımlayabilecek mi? Züccaciye dükkanına giren fil haline geldi. Bir girdi, kocaman gövdesiyle her şeyi yıkıp döküyor. Bu dünya için iyi bir şey değil. Ama dünya için iyi olmayan başka bir şey daha var. Güçlü liderlik dönemi kapandı. Hem Avrupa'da hem Amerika'da. Yani toplumuyla barışık, adaletli, iyi yönetim içerisinde olan ve olayları çözme kapasitesine sahip gerçek liderler dönemi kalmadı. Benim gözümde Trump iyi bir lider değil. Benim gözümde İngiltere'de de iyi başbakanlar yok. Fransa'da da bugünün cumhurbaşkanlarının hepsini toplasanız bir Mitterrand etmiyor. Bir Jacques Chirac etmiyor. Bir Valéry Giscard d'Estaing etmiyor. Almanya'da da böyle. Yani Margaret Thatcher'la İngiltere sonra, belki Merkel'den sonra Almanya'da veya bir başka yerde güçlü liderler, yani söz sahibi liderler, bağırmadan, çağırmadan sadece sorun çözen ve ülkesini refaha ulaştıran liderler dönemi kapandı. Otokrat insanlar dönemi başladı. Ve artık demokrasiden çokça bahsedilmiyor. Belki buna Macaristan bile dahil. Orban'ın yapısına bakarsanız artık otokrasiyle her şey çözülecek düşüncesi hakim. Eleştirilerden uzak değilim. Siz bunu bizim için de söyleyebilirsiniz. Ama dünya yine bir tanımlama var. Kaht-ı rical. Yani adam kıtlığı. Ben buna lider kıtlığı diyorum. Netanyahu'nun bir lider olduğunu ben söylemem. O kendi ülkesinde bile açıkça eleştirilen, dünyada sadece Trump'tan, Biden'dan başka da gerçek dostu olmayan kişi halinde. Sadece öldürmeyi biliyor. Ben burada Sayın Olmert ve Livni'nin sözlerini önemsediğimi ifade ettim. Biz Sayın Olmert zamanında Türkiye'nin arabuluculuğunda Suriye ile İsrail arasında doğrudan görüşmelerin başladığını biliyoruz. O yüzden tebrik ediyorum kendisini. Ama İsrail'in kendi iç dinamikleri bunun devam etmesine fırsat vermedi. Gazze'den hep bahsediyoruz, Lübnan'dan çok fazla bahsetmiyoruz. Lübnan da mahvoldu. Ve maalesef İran'dan kaynaklanan Şii taassubu, mezhep taassubu bütün bu ülkelerde çoğu zaman felaketlere yol açtı. Bütün bunların hepsini topladığım zaman Türkiye kendi bölgesinde bir barış adası olarak çok şükür bulunuyor. Benim de kurucusu olduğum AK Parti 2002'de iktidara geldi. 22 yıldan beri iktidarını devam ettiriyor. Başarılı olduğumuz dönemler oldu. Başarısız dönemlerin içerisinde yaşıyoruz. Belki çok şükür yine de ülkesini belli bir noktada sağ salim tutmayı başarabilmiş bir ülkeyiz. İşe başladığımızda komşularımızla sıfır sorun politikasını gütmüştük. Bu hem güneyimizde başlayan, hem Kafkaslar'da devam eden, hem de Balkanlara kadar uzanan bir güvenlik çemberiydi. Bosna'da bir savaş yaşandı 1992-95 arasında. Türkiye bu savaşta elbette Boşnak kardeşleriyle de birlikteydi. Sırpların da Hırvatların da bu savaşın olmaması için akil insanlarıyla elbette işbirliği yapmıştı. Şimdi şunları söylemekte fayda var. Türkiye 2008'di zannediyorum. Şimon Peres'le Mahmut Abbas'ı bir araya getirip parlamentosunda konuşturan ve kucaklaştıran bir ülke oldu. Şimdi bunlardan uzağız. Elbette çözüm mümkün. Elbette bu çözüme giden yollar mümkün. Hiçbirimiz lider değiliz, görev başında siyasetçi değiliz. Ama tecrübelerimiz var ve bunları konuşabiliriz. Gazze'de yaşanan olaylarda bununla sözümü tamamlayacağım Sayın Moderatör. Sona kalınca böyle bazen vakit sıkıntısına yol açabiliyoruz. Bir defa orada temel bir bölünmüşlük var. Ben bunu yaşayan ve kendileriyle bunu tartışan bir insanım. Filistin Ulusal Konseyi de Yaser Arafat'tan sonra kurulmuş. Resmiyeti olan bir hükümet var ve onun bir başkanı var, kabinesi var. Ama o Ramallah'ta, bir de Gazze'de şüphesiz Hamas'ın da yönetiminde bulunduğu, bir parti örgüt olarak başında bulunduğu bir bölüm var. Onlar İsrail'in varlığını kabul etmediler. Onlarla karşı tarafın kendi aralarında çatışmaları oldu. Halen birleşip seçim bile yapamıyorlar. Biz onlara Türkiye olarak her zaman birleşin, demokratik yollarla bir araya gelin ve kendisi lütfen beraberce ifade edin dedik. Çok acı olaylar yaşandı. 60 bin insan öldü, binalar yıkıldı vesaire. Ben çözüme gidebileceğimizi düşünüyorum ama Netanyahu'nun sırtının sıvazlanmaması yoluyla gerçekleri ortaya koyabilecek şüphesiz Amerika'nın ve kendi bölgemizde etkin olan devletlerin bir araya gelmesiyle. İkaz alıyorum, sözlerimi bu kadarla toparlayayım ama Savaş Sanatı isimli kitabı da olan Çinli Sun Tzu'nun lütfen tavsiyelerini bir defa daha okumakta fayda var. En güzel sözlerinden bir tanesi de o. Hem askeri komutandır hem de mütefekkirdir. En büyük zafer barış yoluyla kazanılan zaferdir diyor. Barışa giden yollarda hepimizin çaba sarf etmesi lazım. Hepinize saygılar sunuyorum. Teşekkür ediyorum.
Well, thank you. I think we can all agree that we need to work hard for peace. And I want to pick up on something you said at the beginning in talking about the role of international organizations and the UN. So I want to go to President Lajcak, who was the president of the UN General Assembly, and maybe can talk to us a little bit about his points of view for how the UN might be able to play a role, not only in helping to better resolve the conflict in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East.
Thank you very much, and I want to say that I agree with what was said on this panel, both about the war in Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza, and I don't want to repeat that, but I want to offer a different angle on all this, namely that the tragedies that we are witnessing are a sad testimony of the erosion of the multilateral system, the very system that was created after the World War II by our predecessors with a very clear aim of not allowing the humankind to sleepwalk into another inferno that could be terminal for our civilization. Of course, the world has changed. The nature of conflicts has changed. We have non-state actors, we have hybrid warfare, we have cyber attacks, we have disinformation campaign. They are not being referred to in the UN Charter, but it does not mean that we should disregard the Charter. On the contrary, we need to adjust our approach. We need what I would call a multi-layered approach. We need the latest technology to counter, of course, the attacks and the actions. We need the ability to win the information war, because social media has become a real actor, and if you cannot win a war if you have lost the war in the social media space. But first and foremost, if we want peace to be sustainable and just, must be based on international law, and that comes with the United Nations, with the Security Council resolution, with the ruling of the International Court of Justice. So what I'm saying is that we need to have United Nations as part of the solution, because, as I said, we get the legal framework. The solution to the war in Ukraine will require humanitarian assistance, which comes with the United Nations, will require peacekeepers, and which comes with the United Nations, will require a mechanism for observing and assessing the implementation of the peace, which I cannot agree more with First Lady, who said that, of course, Ukrainians cannot be told what the peace conditions are. We need to ask you what the peace conditions are. But let us not forget that we have created a system of international organization not for nothing, but exactly for helping us to have the world which is predictable and based on rules. Here comes also the role of regional organizations. Speaking about Ukraine, I would mention the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is well equipped to have its observers on the ground who are reporting about the daily violations of the conditions of peace and report to the political leadership. And of course, I'm coming here to this conference from Brussels, where I've been working for the European Union for the last 5 years. I cannot imagine any sustainable solution without heavy involvement of the European Union. Post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, of course, cannot happen outside of the European Union. It is said that the European Union is sort of asking or begging to be allowed to be part of the process, but whether someone wants or not, European Union will play a very important role. And regional organizations must play a role in solving conflicts because they have the expertise which the global organization may not have. So the bottom line is that instead of criticizing the international organizations, they are our products. We've created them. The world has changed. They need to change. They need to adapt. But we need to invest in it. It's in our interest. The majority of the population of this planet lives in medium-sized and small countries, and our only defense and guarantees is the world which is based on rules which are clear, which are respected, which are enforceable. Otherwise, the dynamics will be dictated by those who don't want to play by the rules, and even if we solve these two wars, we will wake up to another one sooner or later, and that's not what we want. So I think the imperative task for our generation of politicians and diplomats is to make sure that we have a solid and healthy system of international rules based on efficient international organization. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I couldn't agree with you more on the importance of international organizations and rule-based order. So our last speaker is a fellow countryman of mine, Ambassador Philip Lader, who was a member of President Bill Clinton's cabinet and also U.S. ambassador to the UK during the Clinton administration. And I will say, having worked for the U.S. government at that period of time, if we look at what the U.S. did to help promote peace in Northern Ireland, which you were a part of, and also to help promote peace in countries of former Yugoslavia with the Dayton Accords. I think that you had a front row seat working for President Clinton into looking at how the U.S. can play a role. And so I'd like to hear your closing thoughts on, how not only the U.S., but our European allies and people who believe in democracy and rule-based order around the world can help solve some of these conflicts. It's a minor question, a big question for you, but anyway, over to you, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, with such profound and consequential comments made by my distinguished colleagues, what more can I really add as to the path to peace? And so let me simply, as a student of history and someone who's been privileged to be engaged in at least one successful path to peace that you reference, share just a few observations in the limited minutes that we have together. The American writer H.L. Mencken once said that for every human problem, there is a solution that is simple, plausible, and wrong. And perhaps nowhere is that more true than in foreign policy and paths to peace. And consequently, as I reflect on the comments made here today, I think really about several premises that strike me as common to the efforts being described here. The first of these is something that I especially learned as over a dozen years chairman of a company with 200,000 employees who were citizens of 114 nations. That nations and cultures are distinct and distinctive. And in any path to peace, it is highly perilous to neglect or especially to belittle the differences amongst us, just as we celebrate the commonality as we have in this conference. The second observation I have is about America today. And I think the comments I've had in private with many of you over these last 36 hours has suggested that you too perhaps feel, as do many Americans, that we're at Disneyland or Euro Disney on the Space Mountain ride, careening in the dark, left to right, up and down, with excitement and fear, but real concern about what happens if the cart goes off the rails on this ride. But I have to say that America First is not a Trump phenomenon. The liberal historians of the last 75 years have left many of us with the notion that America has not had an isolationist history. But going back to George Washington, certainly Woodrow Wilson and his hesitance to come to European aid in the First World War, and more recently, as you've observed as well, there is a recurrent strain of isolationism in American history, and that has surfaced once again. The concern that I think many Americans share with you is the extent to which that this may lead to an upending of the European security architecture and the extent to which there's a greater risk of nuclear proliferation. You are not alone in these concerns, and I trust that in the White House and in the Congress, these are not neglected concepts as well. And yet, when you talk about the path to peace, the other observation I would have is that there is no one discipline or path to peace. We've had splendid examples presented to us today of how the difficult terrains of contemporary consequential situations are being addressed in different ways. The diplomat who's very much been a model for me, Dag Hammarskjöld, perhaps the most celebrated of the Secretaries General of the United Nations, exercised certain principles of diplomacy, essentially personal engagement, a true lack of bias in dealing with the negotiations, and especially preventive diplomacy. But in the situations that we've discussed this morning, it's a little bit late for preventive diplomacy. And that's why I point to phenomena today in diplomatic missions that were not necessarily exercised in the same way in the era of Dag Hammarskjöld. Essentially, the scrutiny of 24-hour media cycles, the references that have been made already from this platform to the notion of truthiness and where is truth in discussions of international relations today or of domestic policies. The engagement, essentially, of civil society, which brings so many of you and the business community into the path for peace, and not simply the national leaders, and especially the advancement of new technologies that are making both economic incentives, but scientific matters, elements of diplomacy today as well. And so I look at all of these and I say that perhaps most outstanding in my mind of the elements of diplomacy on the path to peace today comes down to a recognition that there is not one path to peace, but frankly, if there was any lesson of the 20th century to all of us, is that on whatever road we take in which terrain is requiring of a unique situation, there's no substitute for partnership. There is no substitute for alliances. And countless Americans share the understanding the importance of the United Nations, of the North Atlantic Treaty, and of NATO. There's a Spanish proverb that there are no roads. Roads are made by walking. And as you have demonstrated, as we see in discussions of Ukraine today, the path to peace is a difficult road requiring emotional and difficult discussions. But each of these are roads that we Americans feel can be walked with greater comfort if we're walking with trusted partners. And we all are concerned that if we reject rather than seek to reform the Bretton Woods institutions, the institutions of a liberal order, world order that were created at the end of the conclusion of the Second World War, that will be a very difficult and unending price to pay. And so in the limited time, my basic observation is this. I think each day of the words of President Kennedy in his inaugural address, and I suspect you might be reminded as I say that of his words when he said, "Ask not what your country can do, ask what you can do for your country." But that's not what comes to my mind each day. You might remember that President Kennedy, at the end of that inaugural address, a very brief one, listed all the world problems that were confronting his presidency as he embarked on it. The challenges, some unprecedented at the time, and today even more complex. And he concluded it by saying that we will ask for God's help. But the words that I remember each day is that in this world, God's work, he said, must truly be our own. And so in that book that he wrote when he was only in his 20s, recently out of university, entitled Profiles in Courage, he identified something that I think we've witnessed here on this stage today, that rarely in the paths to successful peace and for enduring peace, for the promise of prosperity, has there been success without courageous, principled leadership from not one nation, but from a collection of partners of nations. And so I would hope that today, my takeaway from this session is not simply the comments of those who've been leading their countries and have experience in this regard, but the role that all of us and NGOs, as citizens of our respective countries, can recognize the humanity of our leaders and call for them to exercise principled judgment and perhaps in our own individual roles, contribute to that kind of principled leadership ourselves. It's in that hope and that prayer that I thank all of you for letting me share this platform with you today.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you to all the members of the panel. I think those are good words to end this discussion on. And I hope that all of you will engage with the panelists and we'll talk more about a pathway to peace. We're unfortunately over our time, but I hope we can continue the discussions over coffee. So thank you very much.